Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm sort of poacher turned gamekeeper. I was a city economist, and I've just started at the Institute yesterday, so this is my, you are the guinea pigs, so to speak. And I thought we'd start with a bang, the fall of Europe. This is the fall of Rome in 474 AD. I don't think it's going to be that dramatic, you'll be pleased to hear. I don't think it's going to fall in any way the way that there's a definite date of the fall of Rome, but I hope I can show you over the next few slides, the next 30 minutes or so, that we're at a crossroads. Either this continent, which has been so important in the fields of economics, philosophy, culture, art, and military affairs, is going to continue to be a major player, or it is not. And I think it's almost beyond dispute, and indeed even the European Commission accepts this, that without a change of philosophy and a regaining of its mojo, the world is going to be a very different place over the next 50 to 100 years than it has been over the last 500 years. So if we look at this chart here, looking at global GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, in 1990, 30 odd years ago, the OECD accounted for 62% of the world's economy. The European Union, I'm sorry this is all a bit small, but we can actually send you this presentation by email if you'd like it. The European Union was just under a quarter, somewhat bigger than the United States of America. Fast forward 33 years, and the OECD has moved from 62% down to 44%, and Europe has moved basically from a quarter of the world's economy to about a seventh of the world's economy. It's been overtaken by the United States, but most extraordinarily of all, on a purchasing power parity basis, it's been overtaken by China. China was 3% of world GDP, estimated in 1990. Today, it's 18.8%. I know there's issues with purchasing power parity as a measure, but it's a pretty strong indication of how the world's trends are changing, and very rapidly. What is also quite interesting is India. It is quite possible, if current growth rates continue, the Indian economy continues to grow at 6-7% per annum, the European economy at sort of 1% over the next 10 or so years, that the Indian economy will be bigger than the European economy. And I would pose the question, if this plays out in the way that it appears to be playing out, can it be that this continent, and this includes Britain, by the way, is going to continue to be a major player on the global sphere? And will the prosperity of our people, which has been very strong, continue, or will it continue to decline? It is fair to say, however, that purchasing power parity of the total economy is only one measure. On a per capita, a per individual basis, Europe and the United States continue to be very much richer than China and India, but the gap is closing. Now, if we look at growth, the first chart here looks at European growth by decade from 1960. Probably discount that first decade because the continent was recovering from war. But we can see a steadily downward chart in annual GDP growth from sort of 2 to 3% range in the 70s to 90s to 1 and a little bit over the last 20 years. Now, many people argue that this is just a rich thing. As you become rich, you can't grow much further. I want to disavow you of that notion, because if we look at this rather busy chart here, looking at Europe's performance against the United Kingdom in red, Europe's in blue, United States in grey, Australia chosen as a developed westernized country in yellow, and the world in green, the reality is that many other advanced economies have grown much more rapidly, particularly in the last 25 years. So it is not the case that rich developed economies cannot grow. I'm going to argue the problem is a European problem, not a global problem. And just picking up on that point, if we index GDP growth since 2005, and I'm well aware that stats vary from your base point, but 2005 was selected because that was 2 years before the global financial crisis. We look at both the UK and Euro area growing pretty modestly. The UK has managed an index growth of 21% over the last 20 years, Europe 19%. But that contrasts with Australia, 57%, OECD 42%, Canada 41%, and the US 37%. So again, other advanced economies performing very much better. Now, numbers sort of jump off the page, but if we put that in context, if Europe had grown in line with the OECD averages over the last 20 years, its economy would be 3 trillion bigger today, and that's on a base of 15.7 trillion, a very meaningful number, or about $8,500 per head. The second chart here looks at the purchasing power parity of the Eurozone and UK relative to the US. So the US, the average American citizen was about $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a head better off in 1990. Today it's somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000. And the GDP of the European Union, if it was an American state, would be the 50th or 51st richest state. Only Mississippi would have a slightly lower GDP. So there's been a tremendous power and wealth shift over the last 20 or 30 years. Why has this happened? Well, there's a picture of Roman decadence, and we could debate why Rome fell, but many people believe that it came about through as a victim of its success and leading to decadent behavior. And I'm going to present the case that our decadence has been the growth of the state. And we'll come on to that in a second. But we're going to look at the public debt explosion. We're going to look at high taxes. We're going to look at the size of the state relative to other geographies. Contrasting employment law is difficult. It's more subjective. But I think it's beyond doubt that employment legislation and is far more rigid in the European Union and the UK than almost any other jurisdiction in the world. We're also going to look at entrepreneurship, and I don't think it's a coincidence that unfortunately our part of the world hasn't performed particularly well. What you're seeing here is a pretty strong correlation with a gap of about 18 months to 2 years between a spike in the money supply and inflation. And the Institute accurately predicted the huge spike post-COVID in M3, leading to the spike in inflation that we see 2 or 3 years later. But I'll leave that conversation for Tim. If we'd had this lecture just before the millennium, I would have probably said the level of debt in Europe was quite high, at 60% of GDP, which is at the upper end of the supposed Maastricht criteria. Fast forward to today, debt in the Eurozone is up to 100% of GDP. As it happens, one jurisdiction has performed rather worse than Europe, and that's the United States of America. And at the end of this talk, we'll talk about what that might actually mean. But America's seen an even greater debt explosion in the public sphere than Europe has. But averages can be extremely misleading because while the debt increase has been most pronounced in the European context over the last 20 years in Greece, United Kingdom, and France in particular, a number of European countries have been extremely successful at reducing their public debt balance sheets. So the likes of Poland, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and Ireland have seen a very substantial improvement in balance sheets. So the picture is a curate's egg within Europe. Some of the biggest countries performing quite poorly, seeing an overall debt expansion, but it's not a universally negative picture. In tandem with taking on a lot of government debt, Europe is undoubtedly the high tax region of the world. There's a chart later on in this presentation that contrasts tax with Asia and other jurisdictions, and it's even more pronounced than here. But within the EU, taxes average about 42% of GDP. That's broadly unchanged, actually, over the last 30 years. But again, it's a curate's egg. A number of countries have reduced taxes. Ireland, the poster boy of liberal democracy, Sweden, which still has quite high absolute taxes, but has reduced its tax rate very markedly, and as we will see shortly, I think to quite positive effect. And Denmark have cut taxes quite materially. But actually, Cyprus, Greece, UK, and Portugal have increased taxes extremely significantly. And in the UK case, the UK has moved from being a fairly low tax jurisdiction in a European context to an averagely high European tax jurisdiction, and in a global context, a very high tax jurisdiction. I think that's quite dangerous for a country that is very highly dependent on inward investment. So we've had a debt explosion, we've had a tax explosion, and we've had a no growth situation. So not only have we deteriorated the balance sheets of the European economies, but the European economy has lagged very materially other jurisdictions. I don't think anyone disputes this data. It's not controversial. In fact, the EU asked the former chairman of the ECB, Mario Draghi, to conduct a report into what was wrong. And it's to their credit they've done it, actually. You know, part of the, if you're ill, a major, and you can't really establish you're ill until you realize there is a problem. At least Europe has begun to realize there is a problem. The problem with Mario Draghi's 400-page report, which is worth reading because it's got some pretty interesting data in it, is that I think his conclusions are the polar opposite to what I would certainly recommend. He's basically arguing that Europe there should be more Europe, not less. It should be more centralized. And his proposals, I think, are entirely about centralizing. They're entirely technocratic. He's talking about green solutions. He is talking about centralizing research funds, fiscal transfers, protection. And I would argue that actually these are the policies that have been largely behind Europe's failure over the last 20 or 30 years. So I'm going to argue that we need more competition, not less. We need market innovation, comparative advantage, market-based solutions, and a dynamic private sector, something that certainly relative to other jurisdictions, Europe does not have. It's a matter of fact that Europe is the global statist region on the planet. There was an interesting chart. Ewan's presentation earlier talked about the gold standard and why it couldn't be reintroduced in his view today. And one of the reasons he gave was in the 19th century, the state was about 10% of GDP. I haven't got the chart in this pack, but there's a really interesting chart that shows up to the First World War that was indeed the case, and most of that money was spent on defence, with a tiny apparatus round about that and almost no social spending. Between the First and Second World Wars in the UK, the state's expenditure moves up to 20 to 30% of GDP, state pensions introduced, and other welfare reforms. Since the Second World War, we've seen a huge explosion in the state, and particularly, actually, that's continued in the last 20 or 30 years. So when Tony Blair, in the British context, became Prime Minister in 1997, the public sector was about a third of the economy. Today, it's just under 50%. It's 44, 45% of the economy. So the private sector has shrunk relatively, and the growth that there has been has largely come from public spending. Now, what we have here is that Europe generally, depending on country, spends between about 40 and 55% of its GDP on on public spending, and the biggest chunk of that is on welfare, social protection spending, and that's some 10 points higher than the United States of America, and some 20 points higher than most Asian jurisdictions. But I actually think this underestimates the scale of the state really very materially. When I started in the city, and I think Tim will have a similar experience when you work for Lombard Street, the city was largely unregulated, or very, very light regulation. And we've seen an explosion of regulation, for good or ill, over the last 20 or 30 years. So a whole range of sectors, not only is the state controlling the UK case 44% of the economy, but a whole range of sectors are very tightly managed by regulation. So we're looking at the banking industry, financial services generally. The energy market is not a free market in any sense of the word. It's a highly controlled market. And there was no minimum wage when I started my career. You might be pleased there's a minimum wage now, but I'm glad you're not. That shows genuine confidence. But we're seeing an explosion of regulation, and I believe that to be extremely anti-growth. But what we did here, quite simply, was to correlate the size of the average GDP growth achieved over the last 20 years against the current size of the state. And it's not a perfect fit, I'm not going to claim it is, but there's a fairly strong downward sloping line. And if you look at the correlation, broadly speaking, for each 5% decline in the size of the state relative to GDP, you'll increase your growth by about 1% per annum. So a big state, you might choose for political reasons to have a big state, but if you do that, you're almost certainly sacrificing growth simply because my conjecture is the public sector isn't as good an allocator of capital as the private sector. We find a similar thing on tax. This is the EU's tax rate, 42%, the UK's 38%, but running a large fiscal deficit. And then you get down to some developing countries where the tax rate is between 10 and 15%. But critically, against China, with a tax rate of just over 20%, there's a huge gap between the emerging world and the old world. And again, there's a correlation. High tax generally means lower growth. You might choose to have high tax for political reasons, but I would argue there's a price to be paid if you do that. We talked about the minimum wage, very high in the UK context. It is actually higher in Australia and New Zealand, in fairness. And actually, the UK's minimum wage rate is very similar to other Northern European countries. But compared to the United States of America or indeed many emerging markets where there's no minimum wage, clearly a high minimum wage is a regulatory cost. And I use that as a proxy, really, for the clogging up of free markets in employment. Energy prices, Draghi report is quite big on this. It spends a lot of time highlighting that high energy is extremely bad. Prices are extremely bad for the underlying industrial base of Europe, as well as for consumers. To put it in context, electricity prices are 4 times more expensive in the UK relative to the United States of America. So seeing a very, very rapid deindustrialization in the UK. This gap is, this chart here shows the gap with American prices. These are percentages, 100%, that's 200% extra. And you're looking at both France, Germany, and the UK all seeing a deterioration of the terms of trade in terms of energy prices of the United States. I don't want to get into a debate about net zero here, but I think we need to be aware that with energy prices costing a fraction in the likes of India and China of what they do here, that is causing a problem. Probably causes a bigger problem to Germany, given its industrial base than the UK, but the underlying position is not dissimilar. I think this chart's quite interesting. The stock market is not everything, and the Magnificent Seven US companies account for 36% of global market cap, and what goes up can come down, and the valuations of those stocks are extremely high. But the US stock market is of a different quantum to any other market in the world. And even if you combine all European markets, the European markets are a quarter of the size. But I think what is quite interesting is if you look at these are so Nvidia has got a market cap of $3.3 trillion. That is a new company. Microsoft is a fairly new company. Apple's a new company. Alphabet's a new company. Amazon was founded in the 60s, but certainly not 100 years old. Meta Platforms is new. Broadcom's relatively new. Tesla's new. Berkshire Hathaway is an investment company. And JP Morgan Chase has been around forever. Contrast that with the European biggest companies, all of which are actually much smaller. But with the exception of SAP and ASML, most of those other countries were around before the war. Europe has strategic advantage in some really valuable things like luxury goods and consumer goods, but they are not the dynamic growth areas that America has. And if you want to measure it by the world's top 50, the top 50 tech companies by market cap, only 4 are from the European Union and 1 is from the UK. So, and we could also look at other industries like AI, or we could look at green technology, and we would see that actually Europe's position is pretty weak. Now, we can ask ourselves, did this just happen out of random chance and luck? Or is it because there's something about the makeup of America that reinvents itself? And of course, there's no clear and certain answer to that question. But I would say the nexus of large and deep capital markets, a cultural can-do attitude, flexible labor markets, economic geography, etc., has led to Europe's success, America's success, while I think it's fair to say Europe has found really very few companies in that category. Now, this is ironic because 40 years ago or thereabouts, Jacques Delors announced the creation of the European single market. The single market was supposed to provide a similar scale. One of the arguments was that Europe was a series of small protected markets, some truth in that at the time. If we only could create a very large market like the United States of America, we could compete. Some logic in that argument. Unfortunately, it hasn't come to pass. Far from it. Europe has failed to find any significant major company to challenge the total US dominance in technology. Now, there are some green shoots in Europe. It's not all bad news. While the Greek economy is smaller than it was 20 years ago, and the Italian economy has barely grown, albeit Italy showing some signs of life at the moment. A number of European countries have challenged, not Singapore so much, but Australia, OECD, Canada, and the US, Ireland, Poland, and Sweden. I'm not going to dwell on Ireland. Ireland has adopted a very interesting, aggressive tax strategy. It's worked very well for them. Possibly small countries can game the tax system. But I think Sweden is quite interesting because Sweden is a poster boy for those that say the liberal left is the way forward. They have a highly successful social democratic economy. If only we could be like them. Well, if someone makes that case to you, you should point out to them that that was the case 20 or 30 years ago. But actually, Sweden has been cutting taxes. It's reduced its deficit, and it's done exactly the opposite of what the UK has done. But I think the real European divide is between old Europe and Visegrad, Slovenia, and the Baltics. They said in America, "Go west, young man." I will say to you, go east, and perhaps to Poland or somewhere like that. Without exaggeration, on current trends, Poland will be richer than Britain within 10 years if current trends continue. Now, that's extraordinary. Some of that was catch up from a low base. But a lot of that is, I think, down to running a far more sensible fiscal policy, having a slightly smaller state, and actually a very strong and can-do work ethic. So Visegrad has outperformed in terms of GDP growth old Europe by a factor of 2 to 3 to 1 over the last 20 or so years, and are now getting to the point that their GDP per head is certainly approaching Spanish levels and surpassed in some cases, and is not so far from the Northern European countries. I'll skip over that chart, so we've got a bit of time for some questions, but that's effectively just pointing out that debt to GDP, tax and social spending are all substantially lower in Visegrad Europe. So I'm going to argue the old model won't cut it. Now, I think the European leadership is quite sophisticated. They're quite well aware of everything I've said. They might not articulate it quite this way. But I think the unwritten rule was that they were keen politically to provide a decent standard of living for the many as they saw it, knowing that the continent was in decline, trying to export their high-cost, high-regulation model globally. And that strategy was just about credible when the United States of America was prepared to go along with that strategy. The change of leadership in America suggests that that's no longer the case. Now, the truth of the matter is, we don't yet know if the change of leadership in America is temporary or permanent. Europe is making a bet that it's an aberration, and that the high regulatory status model will come back into fashion if and when the Democrats win either at the midterms or, more importantly, at the next presidential election in 4 years' time. But that's a hell of a bet, because if they're wrong on that, and America has culturally changed course, and we don't yet know that for certain, Europe, as a high cost, particularly in terms of energy and regulation network, is going to find it exceptionally difficult to protect its position, particularly when it's used its lives up, is the way I'd like to view it, in terms of their debt to GDP ratios. And unless we all want to go on the road to serfdom, tax rates which are exceptionally high in a global context. So I think the world has changed, and I think Europe's got to wake up and smell the coffee. Certainly some within Europe appreciate that, and there is a philosophical debate going on between some of the Visegrad countries and some of the Western European countries. But the reality is that if Europe cannot re-find a degree of prosperity, and I would argue that they won't do that with status solutions, that Europe might not collapse in the way that Rome collapsed, but it's going to become more and more globally irrelevant. So is there a renaissance, or is it all going to go horribly wrong? I think there can be a renaissance, actually. I would say Europe needs to encourage competition and decentralize. It needs to deregulate. It needs to reduce tariff barriers, and obviously that's quite topical given what's happened recently. And I think it needs to reduce the size of the state gradually. It isn't practical to do it overnight in a big bang, because that, I think, could be socially very difficult, but it is certainly possible to change direction steadily and gradually over a 5 or 10 year view. I'm not saying that the European Commission or the British government is going to do any of these things in the short term, but I think increasingly they're going to be forced to look at it. Europe does face a problem on energy, and it would be dishonest. Some countries face less of a problem than others. Britain could fix its problem more easily because it has carbon assets. That's a value judgment, whether you think we should drill or not. That luxury does not exist in large parts of Europe, but there are carbon assets in parts of Eastern Europe that could be tapped. But energy prices in Europe are certainly extremely damaging to its industrial base. The second easy win is to start to deregulate labour markets. And the other side of that is the extraordinarily generous welfare budgets, which are, relative to other parts in the world, in the long term, I think, are unsustainable. Europe has reached a trade deal with America of sorts. It's arguably slightly less advantageous than it had before, but at least it's not punitive. Allied to that, I think Europe's got to empower its population through labour market flexibility. Its entrepreneurial record is lamentable. Company formation rates vary dramatically by region, but I think ultimately it is not something that can be directed, in my view, by government. Tax competitive, I think, is important. Europe is not tax competitive, and it comes down to, do you philosophically believe the private individual is a better allocator of capital, or do you believe the state is? I certainly believe the private individual is. I made a proposal here, which again I think is a utopian proposal, but all regulation announced over the last 10 years should be a presumption to repeal unless there's an overwhelming reason not to do so. That's a slightly over the top, and I do appreciate there are reasons for many regulations, but it's to highlight just how tangled and regulated we have become as an economy. And relative to much freer markets elsewhere, and that includes Asian markets particularly, that's something I think Europe has got to address. And I think philosophically, this is a cultural point really, that we've built a very large social welfare state, and that's comfortable and cozy, and maybe affordable when China's 3% of global GDP. But I would argue that it is not affordable in the long term, where the nature of the world has changed. So I would set a target of reducing GDP, public spending relative to GDP by 5% by 2035 and a further 5% by 2045. If you run the maths on that, actually it's only readjusting the economy by about 0.5% per annum, and I think that is it's not going to happen in a straight line. But even if you did that, would be the state would still be pretty big by OECD standards. But I think the other critical point, and Ewen touched on this in his presentation, is the Bank of England was founded out of crisis, war, the requirement for money. The state has shown an insatiable appetite for money, be it through taxing or in recent years through quantitative easing. We've got to get a situation where fiscal budgets are balanced or closely balanced, and we're a long way from that. And if policy was my choice, I would cut public spending and recycle the spending cuts into tax cuts, but once the budget was controlled. So, slightly indulgent picture from my old homeland of Scotland. I think there is a warning here from Adam Ferguson, the Scottish economist and philosopher, not as famous as Adam Smith, but he had an adage that any great power that spends more on debt servicing than defense, in the long term, ceases to be a great power. That was his empirical study from 200 years ago. His view was if you were spending more on debt interest, eventually you'd be undermined geopolitically. Now, I know for a fact, because they've tweeted it, that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are aware of this, and they've got reason to be aware of it, because if we look at what's happening now, America, the supreme global hegemon, could fund its military quite easily until about last year, where for the first time debt interest payments became bigger than their $1 trillion a year defense expenditure. Not a problem in the short term. They can get away with it for quite a long period of time until they can't. Unfortunately, Britain's situation is rather weaker. We've breached 200% of GDP, despite our defence budget being pretty modest. And Britain is spending, it varies on an annual basis because it depends what the rate of inflation is, and higher inflation through index-linked gilts. But Britain's spending about 130, 140 billion a year on debt interest repayments at the moment. We are spending, depends how you measure it, 60 or 70 billion on defence. So that's not a great square to be in. Only one European country doesn't breach the rule. France is in a similarly precarious situation. Actually, Germany, of the major European countries, and that's partly because its debt levels are quite a lot lower, and partly because it spends a bit less on debt to GDP on defence. But their position is arguably more sustainable. So I think the size of the state matters a lot. I think the level of public debt and fiscal deficits matter a lot. I think Europe has a pretty extreme growth problem, and that most certainly includes this country. I think we're at a crossroad. We can continue. I think you asked the question, is there going to be an IMF bailout? I'm not going to answer that question either. But if you want my guess, I think it's more likely that we'll continue a steady path of decline than the example of the first picture with the gates being bashed down by the barbarians and Rome is sacked. I think that could happen. There could be an IMF bailout. I'm not going to say it's not going to happen. But I think it is more likely that Europe's standard of living without a change in direction continues to decline at a fairly steady rate.